My role this morning is to share with you some analysis that we've been doing about the specific impact of the austerity measures. So this is the result of a lot of work that we've done, bringing together some analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and some data from the ONS. Now, this is the impact on expenditure of the June budget last year and the CSR of October last year, and what that means for reduced expenditure across those income deciles. And you'll have heard a lot of talk in the press and from politicians about the squeeze middle. Well, if you're taking them literally, you think, well, so much for the squeeze middle, because actually the average across all households will be a drop in expenditure of 3.6%, and actually it's the middle income bands who are least affected, 3.2 for income band 5, 3.2 for income band 8. It's at the extremes, the poorest two income bands and the wealthiest two income bands who experience the biggest cuts. What you have is the percentage changes there in terms of the impact on reducing spending. Now, of course, each of these groups spends very different amounts. Of course, the richest people spend a lot more per week than the poorest people. In fact, they spend on average around £906 per week, and down at the poor end near £207 a week of expenditure. So actually, in terms of impact on spending in pounds and pence, you see a very, very different pattern, because poorer people have relatively less money to spend. So the percentage changes are one thing, but actually you get a very, very different view in terms of where the money will be removed from the economy. That's why you get that picture in terms of who is spending less. It's because people at this end of the income spectrum have rather more money to spend. So that's the picture for income deciles and where money will be removed from consumer spending in terms of people's wealth. It's possible to do a different type of analysis based on some different family types. So much of government spending, and therefore the cuts, has been around your status in relation to having children and whether you're a pensioner or not. That's a big chunk of the public spending and a big chunk of the decision-making around the austerity measures and precisely where they were going to fall. So we've been able to look at three quite broad family types. So the impact on families with children, the impact on pensioner households, and then the impact on the remainder. And so this is the amount that these groups have to spend at the moment. So perhaps not surprisingly, overall, families with kids, they spend rather more per week, £591 per week, compared to pensioners who'll spend just short of £260 per week. You can look at the income per head. Obviously, you've got more people in these households, so actually income per head, it equals out rather more neatly. But overall, as households making purchase decisions, it's the families with kids who spend the most. Now, how will their expenditure be impacted by the tax and benefit changes? Again, it's the families who are going to be hardest hit. And relatively speaking, well, I guess in any other environment, this impact on pensioners would be very high and, political suicide almost, to start cutting pensioners' benefits in such a way that they're going to have 2.7% less to spend. But it's small relative to what's happened with families with kids. I think it emphasises actually within the whole package of measures that were announced, the really big one is the child benefit measures when that come in. And that's not coming in until 2013. They're freezing child benefit, but the removal of child benefit for those people paying in 40% tax bracket doesn't kick in until 2013, so that is still to come. I think it's something to bear in mind that the austerity measures are coming in gradually. We've already had the VAT increase for various others, and it's just going to kind of deepen as we go along. We will be talking about the opportunity in all this at some point as well. I'm sorry, everybody looks so depressed. There is some more optimistic news. So just to translate that through into impact on spending. So the way that works out, because of the different amounts that people spend, will be a cut in spending for families of around £31 a week compared to a cut in pensioner spending of around £7 a week, average being around £18 a week. So that's where in terms of family types, the cut in spending is going to come. For this section, a final sign-off. It is actually possible to combine those analyses and look at the impact of these family types by decile, which gets a bit kind of mind-blowing. But the reason for showing this is just to highlight this point about the child benefit changes, how in some ways that your family status and the impact of that almost kind of trumps everything in terms of putting you down at the kind of biggest receiving end of the austerity measures. Pretty even impact across pensioner groups, whether you're rich or poor, and somewhat differentiated impact across families, and generally a bigger hit coming to families compared to pensioners. Because all those different groups, those different deciles, have different spending patterns. Obviously, the poorer deciles, they'll spend much more of a greater proportion of their income on necessities like food, whereas at the higher end of the income spectrum, higher deciles, much more discretionary spend. You can look at how that translates into spending on different sectors. And here we've used the categories that are provided for us by the ONS, which in some cases are slightly antediluvian, but still, I hope, quite useful. So here you can see that the major impact is on discretionary areas of spending. And some of these definitions possibly just bear a little bit of definition. So by education, we mean private education. Health, it includes prescriptions as private spending, purchases on over-the-counter medicines, things like opticians, restaurants and hotels, pretty straightforward. Recreation and culture includes, for historical reasons, brown goods, so stereos, photography equipment, that kind of thing, but also attendance at sport events, cultural events, that kind of thing. Transport includes spending on petrol and diesel, spending on train fares, airfares. Household goods and services, well, that's furniture, it's your lawnmower, it's your fridge. Communications is fixed line and mobile telecoms. Clothing and footwear, pretty self-explanatory. Housing, fuel and power, so that is your rent or your mortgage payments. It's also your utilities. Alcohol and tobacco is pretty straightforward, and food is pretty straightforward. This other category as well, which is quite large. Charitable donations down 5.2%, vehicles down 6%, holidays down by 6.2%. You might argue or might not argue that alcohol and tobacco are discretionary. They seem to retain a rather high proportion of their spending, which we can all discuss and think about why that might be the case. But again, we must bear in mind it's similar to the analysis when we're looking at consumers. All these sectors have very different sizes. This is what we spend per week in those sectors. So we spend £51 per week on average on food, but only £5 per week on health. So the sectors have different impacts in terms of percentages, but all the sectors are different sizes. So when you work that through in pounds and pence, again, you get a slightly different picture where actually the biggest loser is recreation and culture, so going to the cinema, going to see sporting events, and spending on brown goods. Transport takes a hit, people going out less, and so on. Food, because it's quite a big category. So this is the actual impact in terms of pounds per week. Big drops in vehicles, big drops in holidays as well. So quite a different picture depending on which sector of the economy you operate. And just finally for me, I hope I haven't left you too depressed or too miserable, it's actually possible to look at your sector, wherever you operate, in much more detail. So for example, looking here, just taking three random charitable donations, holidays and vehicles, how different the profile in terms of the impact of the tax and benefit changes compared to the average. So this was the average that I was talking about when I was talking about all consumers here, but different sectors are actually behaving quite differently. And that's the percentage changes. If you look at the money in terms of pounds and pence, it shows why this analysis is really worth bearing in mind. Because if you take something like holidays, you actually see that by far, much the greatest hit is actually coming in this highest decile. You get quite a different pattern. So it is possible to do that analysis too. So that's a kind of overview of which types of consumers will be spending less, purely as a result of the austerity measures, and which sectors are likely to see those cuts.